Now is a good time to start identifying different strategies we can use when we're working on simplifying these trig identities, or what's coming soon is verifying these trig identities. So the first two bullets we've talked about, right? So convert everything to sines and cosines if possible. That's a huge benefit. It works. It's helpful in most of the cases. There are cases where it doesn't help. And again, you really start to make sense of that through experience as you work through these problems. Next up is your Pythagorean identities, right? So we were looking for any type of trig function squared plus or minus 1 or some other trig function squared, okay? And we've done some practice with that. So those are our first two key strategies. Next strategy, there's no necessary specific order here, but they're just different strategies. So one, if we're dealing with fractions, where we're adding or subtracting fractions, common denominators is huge when we're trying to condense them into a smaller piece. So we're going to look, if we're adding, subtracting fractions, look to see if you can make common denominators and simplify. Next up is factoring. I just touched on that in the warm-up number 4. The second method I used. So factoring is going to become a technique you're going to start using. So we want to brush up on some factoring skills if you need to, but look to factor. This last bullet point is going to seem a little odd at first. You actually use a similar technique when you get into calculus, and you studied the conjugate when you went through algebra 2, mostly with complex numbers and irrational expressions. So when you're trying to simplify and you have a fraction, and you're not really sure what to do, maybe everything's already in sines and cosines, one thing you can do is you can multiply a fraction's numerator and denominator, which is really, we're going to multiply by 1, but in the form of the conjugate of the denominator. So we're going to multiply the numerator and denominator of a fraction by the conjugate of the denominator of that fraction. So what does that look like? Let's say you're working on a trig identity. Now, this is a slightly new example. We're not there yet. But the expression would be 1 minus sine x over cosine x equals cosine x over 1 plus sine x. Don't worry much about the left side of the equal sign at the moment, but it's on the right side. So I have a fraction. Everything's in terms of sines and cosines. Can't simplify the way it is. So what we can do is we can take the conjugate of the denominator. So the denominator is 1 plus sine x. The conjugate is going to keep the same first term, so 1, and then the opposite of the second term. So the original is 1 plus sine x. What we're going to do is multiply by 1 minus sine x and 1 minus sine x, right? So that's really a multiplication of 1. And when we distribute here, the denominator in almost all cases is going to produce a Pythagorean identity, which will allow us to condense it even further. And we'll work through some of those examples in a minute.